Continually in its run, this show has introduced a character, established a certain antagonistic image for that character, and then completely undermined that image as the show exposed the fullness of that character in all their complexity, and in doing so made the character one that we can have compassion for and empathize with and understand. And that is quite an impressive feat to do again and again and again. Lilith appears to be a vindictive and callous sister at first, very cold and calculating as opposed to the wild-spirited Ida, but then we see how much remorse Lilith has for what she's done, how much she deeply cares about her sister, and how much she has been deeply trying to heal her sister's curse. Or take Amity. She's first introduced as this arrogant perfectionist, desperate to be the best, regardless of the consequences. But then we see the pressure put on her both by herself and her family that has molded her into this perfectionist, and in doing so left her isolated and alone and longing for a real deep connection with someone. Or take Hunter. At first he appears to be this arrogant brat who only has become the leader of the Emperor's Coven through nepotism, but then we see how much like Luce he is. They're both nerdy and dorky, and they're both desperate to please and to be accepted. Had Luce not had the supportive network of not just Camilla at home, but Ida and King in the Boiling Isle, she might have ended up quite a lot like Hunter. And once we realize that, we cannot view Hunter from a smug sense of superiority. We have to take into account all his flaws and inconsistencies and idiosyncrasies as what they are, as being things that stem from the longings and the wounds of this bitter, broken person. Now, in yesterday's Lie, the last episode in Season 2A of The Owl House, the same kind of transformation happens to Creepy Luce. Now, in the case of Creepy Luce, or the character formerly known as Creepy Luce, the transformation is much more drastic. In the cases of these other characters, we may not have known the fullness of who they were, and we may not have known how raw and vulnerable and desperate they were, but we still had an idea that they were complicated, thoughtful human beings with their own perspectives and their own viewpoints. We did not really have that for the character we now know as V. She was only introduced as a shadowy silhouette who infiltrated Luce's house at the end of episode 4 of season 2. We didn't know her name, and so we just referred to her as Creepy Luce, or Fake Luce, or Imposter Luce. We thought she had some menacing plan. A lot of us, including myself, thought she was connected with Balos to some extent. But none of this turned out to be true. In reality, she's just a lonely shapeshifter who does not really have anyone to rely upon. She was created by Balos as part of his magic extraction plan, and though she was able to free herself from his control, she didn't have any plans or any sense of her own identity. So when she had the opportunity to impersonate Luce and ingratiate herself to Camilla, she gladly took that chance. She filled the role that Luce left open by choosing to stay in the Boiling Isles instead of returning home. She played the part of the kind, decent, obedient daughter. She had Camilla's love only because she was playing Luce, but that was still enough for V. For the first time, she had someone who genuinely cared about her and thought about her well-being. She was part of a family, a community. She had more to rely upon than just her isolated individual self. Now, what will happen to V in the future? As to this, I'm not quite sure. The Owl House has not had the best record in terms of expanding on characters that it has introduced. Now, there are some caveats to this, and I do not want to be too hard on the show, which I do like. Not as much as Amphibia, but I like it quite a bit. Number one, the show still has quite a bit of time left. It still has quite a few episodes. Not as many as it perhaps should have had, but it still has time to figure out a lot of its various character dynamics and what paths these different characters will take in life. And also, I really want to clarify that I am not one of those people who thinks that every single character, no matter how small their part may be, should have their story wrapped up and given a firm and satisfying conclusion. Just because a random passerby in a blue shirt doesn't come back does not mean the show failed or forgot about him. It just means that he was not important to the overall story the show wanted to tell. And I do think that we should acknowledge that for a show with this large of a cast, juggling all these different storylines and different character relationships is very difficult. The show risks becoming jumbled, and I'm glad it has mostly avoided that thus far. I don't really think we need another Gus episode, and though I'd like another Willow episode, I'm not sure we'd need one of those either. But I do think the show has a lot of characters who have so much untapped potential, narratively speaking, that it would be a shame to see that potential not explored. For instance, I'm thinking about Amity's parents. They were talked up in the first season, especially in the Understanding Willow episode, to such a degree that I thought they would be extremely important going forward, just like the Northwest parents were in Gravity Falls. Only to a greater extent, because Amity is much more important to this show than Pacifica was to Gravity Falls. But instead, what's happened is that they have not appeared once since that episode. I assume they will appear again at some point, but considering how often we've seen Amity, it's been interesting that her parents have not come up once. She hasn't even mentioned them. Even more baffling, perhaps, is the show's elision of Ida's sister, Lilith. Lilith was so important to the back half of Season 1, and right at the start of Season 2. I thought she would be a major part of the cast, especially considering the work they did into developing her strange but endearing friendship with Hootie. But instead, Lilith went off with her mother at the end of episode 4, and we have not seen her since. Again, I assume she'll come back at some point, but it is kind of weird that the show spent so much time fleshing out the new Lilith and then sent her away. She has also not really been mentioned. The only time she's really come up in a significant way is when Hootie was writing a letter to her in the 8th episode of Season 2, and even that was more of a framing device than a way to bring in Lilith as a character. I'm kind of afraid that something similar will happen to V, and I really hope that's not the case, because V is a compelling character. This doppelganger who's not evil or manipulative, but rather lonely and looking for a place to really find stability and find people who will support her and find a way to establish her own identity. V is the good daughter that Lou simply could not be. When we are first introduced to V in episode 204, our first impression is that she is some sort of threat to Camilla, which she isn't. Although she is pretending to be Luce and thus acting under false pretenses, she has nothing but affection for Camilla. And why wouldn't she? Camilla has treated her with respect. When she's with Camilla, acting like Luce, she finally has a role to play. She finally has a place in this world. She finally knows who she's supposed to be. And obviously that's a flawed perception of herself in the world, because she can't just keep on pretending to be someone else. Although she doesn't want to be someone else forever, it's better than being rejected. It's better than just being a tool of the Emperor's. It is worth noting that Camilla very much enjoys the company of V as Luce. Camilla is quite a bit disoriented by the extent she believes Luce has changed. But V attributes this to having gone off to camp, and Camilla mostly buys that. Although Camilla is a bit disconcerted when V starts throwing out all of Luce's things. And I think that action V takes, trying to throw out Luce's things, going and changing her hairstyle, it demonstrates that V does not really want to be Luce. She's not super attached to the Luce identity. She relies on it because she believes that it's the only way she can get people to love her and care about her, but she also wants to stake out an identity of her own inside the limited confines of this Luce identity. Of course, over time, the identity is blown. Camilla finally learns that she's not Luce. Luce finally learns that she has an imposter pretending to be her, but although V prepares for the worst, Luce doesn't reject her. Luce is generous and empathetic, and she reaches out to V. Now, it is the case that there are a lot of times in these shows directed at a younger audience, I'm especially thinking of Steven Universe, where they exaggerate the idea of the hero who is so optimistic and so willing to see the best in everyone that it becomes almost parodic. I remember I laughed so hard when Spinell in the Steven Universe movie actually called Steven out on his tendency to always assume the absolute best in everything, in every situation, and everyone. But although this kind of trait can be silly when carried to that extent, it is generally a good trait to have, to try and see the best in someone instead of just making a quick negative decision about what someone must be like. V has only been used to those negative decisions. She's not used to people actually seeing her as a fully formed person with her own identity. And so she's scared that she'll never be accepted outside her identity as Luce, but Luce accepts her, and then Camilla accepts her too. Camilla still wants her in her life. Camilla obviously doesn't want her to keep pretending to be Luce, but as her own person, as V, as this introverted and quiet, but still very passionate and yearning shapeshifter, yeah, Camilla accepts her. Not just as a good and decent being, but as almost a second daughter. She's basically Luce's twin sister. That's how Luce sees her. And I give Luce a lot of credit for seeing her like that, and Camilla might start to see her like that too. So I'm quite interested to see how this relationship between Luce, V, and Camilla develops as the show progresses. Luce wants V to really establish her own identity and establish her own sense of her values and beliefs and ideals. Luce gave Hunter a second chance. That's not to say she trusted him completely, but she saw him for more than just an antagonist. And V has done a lot less in terms of antisocial behavior than Hunter. She's an earnest, if reticent person, and Luce really wants to help bring out the potential of her new sister. It's very sweet, and I hope they continue expanding on V's character as the show keeps progressing. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see another video like this. Keep watching The Owl House. It's been a great first half of Season 2, and I can't wait to see where they go from here. What do you think's going to happen to V? Are you surprised that she was as sweet and awkward and just yearning to really be accepted as she was? Do you think that she will end up staying with Camilla as the show reaches its conclusion? I think that's a distinct possibility. But anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon. That I promise you. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.